Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Grace Boyle, and I am the founder and director of the Feelies. So as introduced, we create sensory stories for immersive environments, which can often include VR. We have in that room there our multisensory virtual reality pod. Please do go check it out while we're here. It's a fairly new field, this sensory storytelling, but I believe it has great potential for sustainable development. Why is that? If we were to define sustainable development, we could define it as economic development without a depletion of natural resources. But that's great. But unfortunately, we live in an anthropocentric age, and I think to protect a natural resource, to not deplete a natural resource, we need to understand its value for us. But what is value? Is it only an intellectual concept? Is it something they only perceive of through learning? Or is it also something that has some emotional value? Because when we value something, we care about it, we feel for it. So let's go to this picture. This is a beautiful forest in the Amazon. What is the value of what I can see from this visual? What is the difference between this visual and this one? In the first one, I see trees. I see no trees. Intellectually, I know that the loss of the trees is bad, the deforestation is bad, but what emotional information do I get about the value of what it is that's being lost in this deforestation process? Let's go back to this. What is the value of this? Yes, it's the trees that I see, but it's not just in its visuals. It is the entire ecosystem that it contains. It's the trees, but it's also the richness of the earth. It's the mycelium networks. It is the cycle of nutrients. It is the creation of oxygen. It is the biodiversity and all of the wildlife forms that supports, and obviously all of the humans that it supports, of us. But I know about those systems intellectually because of scientific research and dissemination of knowledge. But how would I know about them emotionally in a different way? If you were to go to this forest, you would have a far better and greater embodied understanding of those systems and the presence of those systems. And you would know that because you would be able to smell the richness of the soil. You would be able to feel the humidity on your skin. You would be able to feel and hear the crunch of this kind of complex underfoot material. Essentially, you would understand the value of this system and of this natural resource as something that needs protecting because of your senses beyond your sense of vision. So our senses are how we know reality, right? We're sensory beings. They're how you connect with places, how you connect with people, and often they're how you know things emotionally. Your sense of vision is not a particularly emotional sense. It's good for identifying things when they are far away before they come in contact with your body. So at the Feelies, I work on this premise that we are sensory beings and we're constantly taking in information through all of our senses. So yet when we tell stories to people, when we try to make people understand values of things, why are we so often only speaking to their eyes, or to their eyes and to their ears? So the Feelies, I work with perfumers, creative technologists, production designers, artists, but I also work with scientists and base it a lot in physiological and psychological research into the senses. And the more you look at the senses, the more you realize that different channels can bring you different values. And these have different potentials, both for messaging and for perception, and then from that, for storytelling. Sensory inputs beyond vision, essentially, can increase our ability to connect. Two particularly important senses for our sense of connection are touch and smell. So it's been said about touch that the skin is a social organ. And there is research that shows that, for example, if you have a warm pad pressed into the palm of your hand for about 10 seconds, and then you're shown photographs of people, you will feel greater social cohesion with those people. You will find them to be more altruistic than if you have a cold pad pressed into the palm of your hands. Similarly, we have nerve fibers in our skin, the main purpose of which seems to be for social affection. They respond particularly well to a slow stroke of about 5 centimeters per second. It sends you feelings of social cohesion and love and connection with people around you. Social touch, caresses. Our sense of smell as well, if you look at how our sense of smell is kind of lodged into the brain, there is almost a shortcut between the olfactory bulb and your centers of memory and learning in your brain. The other senses kind of get filtered in a way before they go into your memory in a way that your sense of smell doesn't. And you know this because there's nothing that takes you back in memory like the smell of something familiar. It will jerk you back more so than looking at it, more so than touching it, more so than talking about it. And so we find that smell is very important for things like value judgments, for learning, for empathy, for emotion. So how can we use those in storytelling? Again, it's a new field. There's a few examples, which I'm going to share with you now, a few from London where I'm based. This is an experience called My Africa by Vision 3 Passion Pictures with the NGO Conservation International. And it's predominantly a 360 film with some beautiful, incredible wildlife footage. But what I find particularly interesting is they also have this experience that you can go into afterwards. My Africa tells the story of the Rititi Elephant Sanctuary. It's a community-run elephant sanctuary in northern Kenya. And in My Africa Elephant Keeper, this is the embodied experience where you can go and you become one of the keepers who has to care for this sedated baby elephant. How they made it, they took thousands of photographs of inside of a shelter and then put them through a digital program to reconstruct an almost photoreal digital environment using a process known as photogrammetry. In the experience, you're wearing this backpack PC, so the computer is actually on your back. You're not tethered to anything. You can walk freely. You're wearing the virtual reality headset, and you are able to walk through this photoreal digital recreation of the same shelter. In front of you lies this sedated baby elephant. You're not able to touch that, but what you are able to touch is a series of objects, and you use the objects to then touch and interact with the elephant. This is a concept we call kinesthetic empathy, this idea that by embodying the actions of others, you're better able to empathize with them and kind of go into their experience. So one of the things they did is took a 3D scan of the feeding bottle with which the keepers will feed the elephant, and in the experience you also need to feed the elephant. And then they 3D printed it back in the UK, and it has a tracker placed in it, which allows very good fidelity between what you're seeing in your virtual world and then also the physical object. So I'm in the experience, I'm given a task, which is now that I need to give the elephant water, reach out and get the bottle. I reach out my hand and I'm able to actually pick up a bottle, and as I move that around and I take it over to the elephant, it follows in my vision where I'm taking it in real life. So your sense of reality, your sense of presence is hugely increased. It's another experience, a little older. This one is called In the Eyes of the Animal by a studio called Marshmallow Laser Feast. And this takes you into a forest in the UK, but through the perception of 4 different animals going up the food chain: a midge, a frog, an owl, and a dragonfly. To make this, they took LiDAR scans of the forest. You can see they're kind of, and then there's been this artistic color scheme placed over them, and you can see the forest in point cloud. The staging of this was, their launch was actually in a forest. So you walk into the forest as a human with all of the sensory surrounds that you have there, and then you place on these helmets they had made, which contain the virtual reality helmet inside, and then you enter into the visual perception of whichever of the animals you go into. And that's altered. But you also enter into other sensory perceptions of these animals. So if you can see here, they're all wearing these backpacks. You'll find a similar one in the pod there. It's a sub-pack, and it's a haptic device, so it can transmit vibrations to your body. So in this experience, the way they've used it is that is to impart some of the bodily sensations of the animals whose perception you're inhabiting. So when you're in the dragonfly experience, you can feel the thrumming on your back of the dragonfly's wings, which is at the same frequency as a dragonfly's wings will beat. When you are in the experience as a frog, you feel sound through your body because of the way that a frog uses its skin as a membrane to negotiate its surroundings. This is the experience that we're here with today. It was made with Greenpeace and Alchemy VR and the Feelies. And it's about the Munduruku, who are indigenous people of the Brazilian Amazon. What we've really tried to do with this is to create original content that's multisensory from the first concept stage. So going back to what I was saying about understanding the different ways that the different senses can bring you different information, understanding, based on the story we want to tell, which of the senses make most sense to communicate those parts of the story. So it's not necessarily that literal. It contains 360 video, binaural sound, haptics, heat, wind, a little humidity, an olfactory narrative of perfumes that we created for the experience. For the setting, we weren't in a forest. We have created our own pods, which you'll be able to see the final version out there. These are some of our early drawings by the designer Mark Tildesley, because there's no headset for multisensory VR, so we essentially had to make one. This is a blank stage for any multisensory 360 content. These are the Munduruku people of Sore Moiba village, and so they were, when we met them through Greenpeace, they were fighting particularly a large hydroelectric dam on the river Tapajos, where they live. It's the last major undammed tributary of the Amazon, and this dam would have been an extremely unsustainable method of energy generation. Luckily, that project has now been cancelled to date, but they're still struggling to be able to demarcate their land, which will give them legal and administrative rights to resist unsustainable projects such as the large dam. So as part of making this experience, we went and stayed with the Munduruku for 2 weeks with Alchemy, Greenpeace Brazil, and then that's to the right of me is a perfumer called Najib Shaibu, and so he came with us as well to take in the sense of the jungle. What's another thing that's wonderful about sensory storytelling is that it makes a lot more room for agency of the people whose story that you're telling. It's less dictatorial. When we went to the forest, we had our first meeting with the Munduruku, and we said, can you show us the sensory parts of this forest? And although they'd had international journalism camps and they'd even made a 360 before, no one had ever asked them that. But of course, to them, the forest is a sensory place. And so that was an incredible privilege to be able to go around and to be brought things and saying, this has an incredible smell, or you can taste this sap from this tree. And all of that then informs the experience that you'll make to tell their story to people who are not as lucky to go to the forest. Rather than just being able to see something and then smell it, it's important to think about your coherent narrative across all of your sensory inputs. For example, this is the olfactory narrative. Smell is a very hedonic sense, so it's not really to do with identification, it's to do with whether you like it or whether you don't. You can't always control what people like and what they don't, and you also don't want to give people something that's too disgusting because they want to get out of your experience and they leave your story. So these are the Portuguese names is coffee, manioc harvest, jungle, distress. So the contrast of these two in time, this is a kind of a very organic scent that depicts kind of the jungle and its rich biodiversity, and this is the scent of deforestation. Again, that's not literal, it's more that change from a natural environment to an industrialized environment. So it's petrol, it's tarmac, it's asphalt, it's the sweat of the people that are using the machinery that cuts down the trees, and we try and encapsulate that in a scent. So even if some people would like that, maybe their dad worked as a trucker, you have the contrast, and you make a point through that contrast. This is an interesting one as well as number 6, is distressed forest. And so although in the experience, I won't give away too much, but you learn about the Munduruku, their way of life, you learn the threats that face in that jungle, and then you go back to the present day, which is before these threats have overtaken it, because you're invited to have agency as part of this experience to stop that destruction taking place. However, we didn't want you to feel that everything was all right. There's this sense of a threat that hangs over this place, and we chose to put this in as an olfactory signal. So you have the scent of the forest, but it's still, again, laced with the scent of that deforestation scent. It's interesting to see if people can necessarily perceive it or not. This is an example, is the way that a variety of sensory stimuli would come together in one scene. So this is the first scene where you enter into the Munduruku's home, and we wanted people to be able to emotionally connect to the idea that it was their home, rather than just know it intellectually. So the visuals you see as a family at breakfast, that's something you can perhaps recognize from your own home. But what is a scent that you can recognize from your own home? Because your sense of smell and your sense of home are so strongly linked. We have a pan on the stove, and then there's coffee. There's a gentle atmospheric heat that's not too much, which sort of surrounds. You feel the directional heat of the fire on the stove. And we also place the warm cup into your hand, which allows you to feel that you're there, but it also allows you to feel that you can make good social connections with these people that you're seeing across these digital interfaces. Here's the messages that each will give. This was, you see the one put in there, this was we launched in Brazil, so it was always very important to try and make a link between urban and rural environments within a single country. So we launched with a 1-month exhibition in Sao Paulo, with some 2,000 people went through, and it also contained photography exhibitions of the Munduruku, some living plants from the Amazon, all of these different ways using installation that you can bring in different elements to allow people to inhabit a story in an embodied way, their journey through the experience and then into the digital sensory parts. We worked with universities who did kind of surveys, because I can talk about all this, but is it actually of any good? We got a lot of responses, but these are some that I found was interesting. And of course, if we're thinking about sustainable development and we're thinking about Greenpeace as an advocacy organisation, things like this are particularly interesting. It changed my view on the importance of the citizen in society in relation to deforestation. How can we build connections between an area where deforestation is a real and immediate everyday reality and somebody who's living an urban lifestyle? How can you make people feel connected? How can you build agency for these causes? Is with the larger responses. And again, we found this very interesting, because one of the things which I used to work for Greenpeace, and the challenge is that it's a lot easier to make people feel empathy for animals, and quite a lot of the time it's difficult to build empathy between urban and indigenous populations within the same country. So we found this very interesting, is that 56% of people completely agreed that they believe they could be an ally in the struggle of indigenous peoples, 36% agreed, and most people strongly felt that society did play an important role in the protection of the Amazon. That was what we wanted. So my time is up. The pod is over there. It's one person per 20 minutes. So if you haven't got your name down, please do try and come inside before the time is up. Thanks so much for having me.